What if I told you that the chair you're sitting on has its own secret life, a reality completely independent of whether anyone is there to experience it? Sounds a bit out there, doesn't it?
Hey, yeah, it does initially.
But that's the kind of fascinating jump-off point we encounter when we delve into object-oriented ontology.
What's truly intriguing is that this initial strangeness can actually lead to some incredibly insightful ways of understanding the world, moving us away from purely human-centered perspectives.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to explore today. You, our listener, shared a really thought-provoking interview with Niels Hexbohr about the ideas of Graham Harman and his object-oriented ontology, or ooh!
Right.
Now, that name might sound intimidating, like something from a, dusty philosophical tome,
It does have that ring to it.
but Niels himself mentioned that he can explain these concepts to high school students, so
Hmm.
take a deep breath. We can definitely unpack this together.
Indeed. And we couldn't have a better guy than Niels Hexbohr. He's a philosophy teacher and PhD candidate at Erasmus University.
Mm-hmm.
He's currently researching ecological ethics for secondary philosophy education, where Harman's work is pretty central.
And he translated one of Harman's books, too, right?
That's right, yeah, he translated Harman's book, Can Things Be Queried? So he's got a really deep understanding of this material.
Exactly. So our mission today is to extract the core ideas of O, understand why they're generating so much discussion in philosophy, and explore some of their, well, truly surprising implications,
Uh-huh.
all based on the insights Neil shared in that interview. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Who is this Graham Harman?
Well, he was born near Iowa City, USA. Interestingly, he found himself drawn to continental philosophy.
Which is unusual for the U.S., contextually speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
Eh,
As Niels pointed out, it's a less typical path in the U.S., where analytic philosophy, with its focus on logic and math, tends to be more dominant.
It's always fascinating to see how different philosophical schools gain prominence. Niels mentioned the Continental Wave in the US and the UK during the 70s and 80s.
Right? That brought thinkers like Derrida into the spotlight over there.
Hmm.
And for Harman, apparently a really pivotal moment was encountering the work of Link, who was an American translator of the philosopher Levinus.
Ah,
He's written about how this encounter significantly shaped his thinking.
then his academic career has been quite unique, hasn't it? Postdoc in Amsterdam, University of Cairo?
Yeah, a very different trajectory from the sort of traditional U.S. academic path.
For sure.
Precisely. And now he's at the architecture faculty in Los Angeles.
Which seems relevant given his more recent books.
Absolutely. It's telling that his recent books increasingly engage with the field of architecture. He's really carved out his own influential space within academia, not being tied to a major U.S. university.
Niels described him as remarkably friendly, almost Belgian in his warmth, which was a lovely image.
Yeah.
But then he also mentioned a sense that Harman holds something back, which almost seems to echo his concept of withdrawn objects that we'll explore later. What do you make of that contrast?
That's a really insightful observation, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's almost as if his personal demeanor subtly reflects some of the core tenets of his philosophy. And Hexbohr also noted Harman's brashness, his ability to quite directly dismiss major figures like Kant.
Wow, okay.
It suggests a real confidence in the own philosophical direction.
It does, and here's where it gets really interesting. Apparently, during his graduate studies, Harman worked as a sports reporter.
Get out, really.
Yeah, and you can actually see that in his writing, a real clarity and engaging style. He can explain complex ideas with a surprising directness.
That makes sense. That background clearly contributes to his accessible writing, which is quite a departure from some of the, well, denser prose you often find in continental philosophy.
Right.
It likely plays a significant role in his influence, despite not being, a household name outside of academic circles.
Exactly. So Harman operates within this broader philosophical movement known as speculative realism. What's the central idea behind that?
Okay, yeah, this is key to understanding. Speculative realism, as Niels explained, emerged from a shared dissatisfaction with 20th century philosophy's overwhelming focus on the correlation.
Correlation. Okay, unpack that a bit.
Think of it like always needing your glasses to see the world. You can't imagine the world without them. The correlation is the idea that philosophy got too fixated on the relationship between our thinking and reality, almost assuming they're inseparable.
Right. The idea that philosophy became too focused on how we experience things, that navel-gazing, as Niels put it,
Okay.
rather than the things themselves. Niels mentioned phenomenology and Kant as examples of this focus on the correlation.
Precisely. The speculative realists argue that this preoccupation with the correlation creates a fundamental problem. It struggles to account for the reality that existed long before human consciousness.
Right, that's where Quentin Meillassoux arch-fossil argument comes in.
From after finitude.
The very existence of fossils proves that a reality existed independently of human experience. It seems obvious, but as Niels pointed out, much of philosophy had seemingly lost sight of this fundamental point.
It really had, yeah.
So the core idea of speculative realism is that reality exists whether we're thinking about it or not.
Exactly. That's the shared starting point.
Yeah.
Within this broad agreement, different thinkers within speculative realism branch out with their own specific ideas of how to understand this independent reality.
And Harman's O is one of these branches. Niels mentioned a few others, Meillassoux.
Right. Meillassoux, who seeks to access reality through the certainty of mathematics, Ray Brescier with a more nihilistic perspective,
Okay.
and Ian Hamilton Grant drawing on Platonism and Schelling. Manuel de Landa had a less direct connection, it seems.
Right, more peripheral.
Yeah. The formal beginning of speculative realism is often marked by a conference in 2007 that brought these key thinkers together.
Got it.
And importantly, as Niels highlighted, Harman explicitly positions himself in opposition to the legacy of major figures like Deleuze, Derrida, and Foucault.
Ah, the big names.
Yeah, thinkers who significantly shaped continental philosophy before speculative realism gained prominence. It's almost a philosophical declaration of independence.
It really is. Okay, so we've got the philosophical context. Now let's really dive into the term object-oriented ontology itself. Niels broke it down into 3 parts: object, orientation, and ontology. Let's start with object. What does Harman mean by that?
Simply put, for Harman, anything that exists is an object.
Anything.
Anything. As Niels clearly stated, this includes you, me, this table, a glass of water, a cat, but also things like dreams, Peter Pan, Bach's fugues, even the Pythagorean theorem.
Wow.
So the first key insight here is this radical leveling. Everything that exists in any form is on the same fundamental footing as an object.
That's a really expansive definition, isn't it? It challenges our everyday understanding of objects as purely tangible things.
Completely.
And Niels made a great point about how this includes particular unshared objects, like an individual's dream.
Exactly. That's crucial too.
Okay, so that's object. Now, orientation. What's the shift in focus Harman is proposing?
Well, the orientation part signifies a shift in philosophical focus. Instead of being so preoccupied with human consciousness and how we perceive things that navel-gazing Niels mentioned,
Right.
philosophy should orient itself towards objects themselves.
Okay.
The takeaway here is a deliberate move away from human-centered thought towards the world of things.
And this reorientation has significant implications, especially when we think about contemporary issues like the climate crisis.
Absolutely. And our relationship with non-human entities generally, it encourages us to look beyond our human-centric view and consider the perspectives, so to speak, of other objects.
And Niels touched on Harman's metapolitical stance here, which sounds interesting. He doesn't fit into traditional left-right divisions.
No, not neatly. He focuses instead on what he calls truth, political, power, politics.
Explain that a bit.
This is a key aspect of his thinking. He sees the traditional political spectrum as somewhat limited and prefers to analyze how power dynamics and claims of truth operate in relation to objects and events in the world. Less about fixed ideologies, more about how things actually play out.
Okay, so object in orientation that leaves ontology. That sounds like a particularly intimidating philosophical term.
It can, yeah, but at its heart, ontology is simply the study of being or reality.
Okay.
As Niels pointed out, UO aims to describe reality by focusing on these objects we've just defined. So it's a theory that wants to explain the fundamental nature of reality by directing our attention to what objects are and how they exist.
So it's a framework for understanding what it means for something to be.
Exactly.
That's the core insight.
So to recap, object-oriented ontology is a theory that wants to describe the nature of reality by focusing on everything that exists, all objects, rather than just human experience.
Yeah.
That sounds, well, revolutionary in its simplicity.
It kind of is, yeah.
Now, how does Harman actually view these objects? Niels mentioned a distinction. Yes, this is where it gets really interesting. Harman distinguishes between sensual objects and real objects,
Okay.
which are 2 ways an object can exist. Sensual objects are how an object is experienced by another object during an interaction.
Niels give a great example. I experience this table as something to put a glass on,
Right.
but a snowflake would experience it completely differently, perhaps as a place to stop and melt.
Exactly. It's all about the specific interaction between two objects.
And Harmon extends this concept of experience really broadly, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely, far beyond human consciousness. He posits that any interaction between two objects constitutes a kind of experience or event.
Even inanimate things.
Yeah, even something like a snowflake melting on the sun. It's a very broad understanding of what it means for objects to relate to one another.
That's a pretty radical broadening of the term experience. Okay, so that's the sensual object, how an object appears in relation to others. What about the real object?
The real object, on the other hand, is how an object exists independently of its interactions with other objects.
So its own inherent being.
Precisely. As Niels said, Rubin exists on his own, Niels Hexbor exists on his own, the table exists on its own, regardless of their sensual interactions. Even our inner monologue or self-awareness can be considered a sensual object, how we experience ourselves.
Okay, interesting.
So every object has these two facets: how it appears in interaction, sensual, and its underlying inaccessible reality, real.
So there's the object as it interacts and appears, and then there's the object in its own being, separate from those interactions. This leads to a really intriguing idea about the limits of our knowledge, doesn't it? The concept of withdrawn objects.
Exactly, because Harmon argues that direct access to the real object is impossible.
Impossible.
Impossible. Our knowledge is always mediated through interaction, resulting in a sensual object. We can have indirect experiences of real objects, but they always remain indirect.
So the real thing always hides, in a way.
Yeah, this is why real objects are always somewhat withdrawn from our full understanding.
So these withdrawn objects are the real entities that always recede from our complete grasp. Niels related this to the human experience.
Right, thinking you know someone intimately, only to be surprised by their actions. There's always a part of them that remains unknown, withdrawn.
That's a perfect analogy, so we never fully get to the bottom of anything.
That's the idea. And this inherent unknowability of real objects is central to UL. It means we can never fully grasp the essence of anything.
Now, one of the most striking aspects of UL is its flat ontology. What does that entail?
Flat ontology proposes that humans are not at the top of some kind of hierarchy of being.
The great chain of being goes out the window.
Pretty much, yeah. Instead, all objects, whether they're human, animal, plant, mineral, or even abstract concepts, have equal ontological standing.
Meaning?
Meaning they all equally are. Think of it like this. A pebble and a person both equally exist. They have the same fundamental right to be considered real.
So it's a direct challenge to those traditional hierarchies that place humans above everything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It creates a more horizontal ordering, which Niels likened to Deleuze's plane of immanence.
Right.
This flat ontology has profound implications for how we understand our relationship with nature. It breaks down the sharp separation between humans and the environment.
Suggesting more interconnectedness.
Exactly, a more interconnected reality where all objects have their own inherent existence and value independent of us.
Okay, but given that we can't directly know these real withdrawn objects, how do we even begin to engage with them? Niels brought up the crucial role of metaphor here, which I found quite counterintuitive.
Yeah, this is a key element of Harmon's theory. Because direct access is impossible, we need indirect ways of relating to real objects.
And he's critical of some other ways.
Right. He critiques what he calls undermining, reducing an object to its component parts, and overmining, reducing it to a larger category as ways of dismissing the unique experience of an object.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Undermining is like saying a beautiful painting is just canvas and paint. Overmining is like saying it's just art. Both lose something essential about that specific painting.
Right. Niels gave the example of saying love is just brain chemicals, undermining, or that it's just a bourgeois ideal, overmining. Both approaches fail to take the actual lived experience seriously.
Exactly. They explain it away rather than engaging with it.
So if we can't know objects directly or reduce them, how does metaphor help us bridge that gap?
Harmon argues that only art and the experience of metaphor allow us to take experience seriously and engage with objects beyond their mere properties.
Art is the key.
For Harmon, yeah. Niels used a fascinating analysis of the film Madres Paralelas to illustrate this.
That was a great example. The film initially seems like a telenovela with all the plot twists.
Yeah, it's the baby swap stuff.
Yeah. but then shifts to focus on the character's search for her great-grandfather's remains in a mass grave. The final scene, where Penelope Cruz's character looks at the mass grave and sees her living loved ones, not literally bones. That's so powerful.
Exactly. It's not a literal representation, but it conveys a deep emotional truth about connection, loss, and history.
It connects things that aren't literally the same.
Right. The metaphor connects two disparate things without a literal correspondence.
Yeah.
As a viewer, you have to actively work to make that metaphor meaningful, to sort of embody the character's experience of seeing her living loved ones in that grave.
Okay.
Art, through metaphor, creates a connection with something separate, allowing us to carry its qualities and better understand it indirectly. So metaphor becomes a crucial tool for grappling with the withdrawn nature of objects.
So literal descriptions reduce objects to their properties, undermining the richness of experience.
Right.
Whereas art, through metaphor, forges a connection that allows for a deeper, albeit indirect, understanding. Niels mentioned Harmon's example. The flame is like a cypress.
Yeah, it's not a scientific equation, obviously.
No.
But it evokes qualities, the flickering, the reaching upwards, maybe a certain shape or energy.
It's almost like the cypress is method acting as a flame, as Niels put it.
That's a brilliant way to put it, the theatricality of it. Niels also touched on how this idea of the theatrical is crucial for gaining access to experiences different from our own.
Like the pig example.
Yeah, even using the slightly absurd example of trying to act as a pig to understand something about that being. It's about embodying a different perspective, however imperfectly.
This makes sense even with abstract objects, like a Bach prelude. How do we approach something like that metaphorically? Or even mathematics?
Well, with mathematics, Harmon might see it as a form of overmining, potentially, reducing the richness of reality to abstract formulas.
Okay.
But with the Bach prelude, it's about experiencing it through emotional resonance, connecting with the composer's intent, perhaps.
The feeling it gives you.
Exactly. And even noticing the mismatch between the music and our own emotional state. All these relational aspects allow us to engage with the piece in a meaningful, albeit indirect way. It's about the feeling the music evokes, not just its structure on the page.
This all seems to point towards a very different kind of ethics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For Harmon, ethics becomes fundamentally about having a good relationship with objects.
A good relationship. How so?
Niels used the somewhat whimsical example of a carefully prepared five-star meal being followed by a cheap cola as wronging the objects involved.
Huh.
Not respecting their individual qualities and the care that went into them. It's about attentiveness to the specific being of things.
So OO offers a basis for ecological ethics that moves beyond just the utility.
Right, or even the inherent value of nature for humans.
It's about our inherent relationship with it in this flat ontological framework.
Exactly. Where a tree has as much fundamental being as we do.
It shifts the focus from those human-centric versus nature-centric debates.
Precisely. It moves towards a more fundamental attentiveness and understanding of our interconnectedness with all objects. It's less about abstract rules and calculations, more about cultivating a sensitive engagement with the world around us.
And what about politics? How does OO intersect with the political sphere?
Well, Harmon critiques the traditional left-right divide and the idea of a single political truth.
As too simplistic.
Yeah. He argues that politics should be more about engaging with the diverse array of objects and what's really happening, recognizing the multiple interests at play in any political issue.
Acknowledging all the different players.
Exactly, human and non-human. It's about acknowledging the agency and reality of all the different objects involved.
Niels mentioned Harmon's concept of diamine.
Right. Diamine as a kind of middle ground between overmining and undermining in political thought. And the connection to Latour's idea of object-oriented politics.
The parliament of things.
Yeah, where even non-human entities have a kind of voice, or at least need to be considered in political deliberations.
How would that work in practice?
Well, the diamine is about finding a way to engage with the complexities of political issues without reducing them to simplistic ideologies or just raw material interests. Niels used the example of the nitrogen crisis in agriculture to illustrate this.
That was a great example, seeing the BBB's romanticized view of the countryside as overmining.
Right, ignoring the environmental impact.
And the REM's purely scientific nitrogen measurements as potentially undermining the lived experience of the farmers and the environment itself.
Yeah, reducing it just to numbers.
The object-oriented approach, as Niels described with the role-playing exercise where students represented different stakeholders, even the nettles, allowed for a more nuanced understanding.
Right. It forces you to consider the multifaceted nature of the crisis, the different realities involved.
It highlights how OO can encourage a more empathetic and multifaceted approach to complex political challenges by considering the perspectives and realities of all the objects involved.
Definitely.
It makes you wonder how we might live an object-oriented life in our day-to-day experiences.
Yeah. It encourages a greater awareness of and engagement with the objects around us. It challenges our tendency to project human desires and blame onto external things.
Like kicking the chair you trip over.
Exactly. The naughty chair example Niels mentioned. He also connected this to the work of other OO thinkers like Timothy Morton with his focus on ecology and Ian Bogost.
Bogost's idea of a more playful and experimental approach to life, interacting with the resistance of objects the way a sticky door handle pushes back, sounds particularly intriguing.
It does, doesn't it?
Very.
It speaks to the affirmative and life-affirming nature of OO, as Niels pointed out, a refreshing lack of world weariness in its perspective.
Yeah.
It suggests a way of engaging with reality with curiosity and a sense of wonder at the sheer being of things.
Now, Usi seems to contrast with some other philosophical trends, particularly the Deleuzian emphasis on events as flows of forces and constant becoming. How does Harman view events and composite objects?
That's a good question. Harman sees objects as having a more stable structure compared to Deleuze's focus on continuous flux.
So less about flow, more about things.
Kind of. While objects certainly change and interact, Harman aligns more with Heidegger's emphasis on being as a more fundamental aspect of reality than constant becoming.
Okay.
He uses the example of the American Civil War as an object with a discernible beginning, middle, and end, even though it's composed of countless individual events.
So the war itself is an object.
In his view, yes. A complex composite object.
And within that larger object of the Civil War, you have all the individual soldiers, weapons, battles, and so on as separate objects themselves.
Exactly. It's like a nested structure of objects, though all existing on that flat ontological plane we talked about.
Right.
And new objects can emerge from interactions like two colliding planes forming a new colliding planes object, which can even retroactively affect how we understand the individual planes that collided.
Okay, so the boundaries are a bit fuzzy sometimes.
Yeah, ultimately, Harman prefers to consider both what we typically think of as objects and events under the same broad category of object.
Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear a bit more about Niels Hexbohr's own dissertation and how Harman's ideas are informing it.
Sure. His dissertation is titled Developing an Ecological Ethics for Secondary Philosophy Education.
Okay.
And he's using Harman's concept of having a good relationship with objects as a core principle for ecological ethics.
Bringing it into education.
Exactly. Aiming to bridge the traditional divides between human-centered and nature-centered perspectives by emphasizing our inherent interconnectedness with all of nature within that flat ontological framework.
That sounds like fascinating and really relevant work. Finally, Niels offered some recommendations for further reading for those who want to delve deeper into OO.
Yeah, he did. He suggested Tool Being and Guerrilla Metaphysics for those with a philosophical background interested in Harman's engagement with phenomenology.
Right.
For understanding OO's implications for art and objects is key. And for architecture, his more recent work in that area.
And for a general intro.
He recommends Object-Oriented Ontology, a new theory of everything, as a good general introduction, which, as we mentioned, Niels himself expertly translated.
That's probably the best place to start for many.
Probably. He also noted Harman's ongoing lectures and his own positive experiences meeting Harman at philosophy festivals, describing him as both friendly and deeply thoughtful.
Fantastic recommendations. So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's just reiterate a couple of key insights that really stood out.
Right.
First, the idea that absolutely everything, from a tangible thing to an abstract thought, holds the status of an object is a truly radical and perspective-shifting concept.
Definitely changes how you see the world.
Second, the notion that these real objects are always somewhat withdrawn from our direct knowledge forces us to reconsider the very nature of how we understand things.
The limits of knowledge, yeah.
And finally, the surprising and crucial role of metaphor in allowing us to indirectly connect with and gain insight into these withdrawn objects offers a powerful new way of thinking about art and communication.
What's truly compelling is how these seemingly abstract philosophical ideas can actually prompt us to re-examine our everyday experiences and relationships with the world around us.
Making us pay more attention.
Exactly. Encouraging a deeper level of attention and a move beyond purely utilitarian perspectives.
Absolutely. And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you, our listener. Could considering even abstract concepts like justice or truth as objects with their own inherent reality and perhaps even a degree of withdrawnness offer new ways of understanding and engaging with them?
Hmm, that's interesting. Treating justice like a thing with its own hidden depths.
Or, if we truly can't directly know anything in its entirety, how does that fundamentally shift the way we approach our relationships and our pursuit of knowledge?
It certainly raises a really important question about the limits and possibilities of understanding and connection in a world populated by these ever-elusive objects.
Huge thanks to Niels Hexbohr for sharing his expertise and illuminating these complex ideas for us.
His insights were truly invaluable in helping us navigate the fascinating terrain of object-oriented ontology. It was great stuff.
And to you, our listener, we encourage you to explore the recommended readings and delve further into the intriguing world of object-oriented ontology. We'll be sure to list those books in the show notes. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.